It's ridiculous. It has to stop. That is how Assistant District Attorney Christopher Conroy began his description in court today of Donald Trump's violations of the gag order against him before Judge Juan Merchan continued the jury selection process, which ended the day with the full jury of 12 seated and one of the 6 alternate jurors chosen. The judge plans to seat 5 more alternate jurors, possibly tomorrow, and be ready to hear opening statements from both sides in the case beginning Monday. When the 12th juror was seated today, the judge said, "We have our jury." The day started with a new presentation by Assistant District Attorney Christopher Conroy about Donald Trump's newest violations of the gag order against him. And as predicted on this program last night, Donald Trump's attack on the jury that we reported here last night was presented to the judge beginning with these words: "This is the most disturbing post." District Attorney Conroy reminded the judge of, quote, "of the specific direction and order that Your Honor gave the defendant on Tuesday in court related to an outburst he had when the juror was at the rail." Then District Attorney Conroy reported to the judge that last evening, quote, the defendant posted on his Truth Social account the following: "They are catching undercover liberal activists lying to the judge in order to get on the Trump jury." Donald Trump's lawyer insisted that that was not a violation of the gag order. In fact, he said, "It brings to light some of the ambiguities in the order." The Trump lawyers insisted that the gag order did not prevent, quote, "reposting statements that are already in public by others." That is, of course, another lie told by a Trump lawyer in court directly to a judge. The gag order prevents Donald Trump from, quote, "making or directing others to make public statements about any prospective juror or any juror in this criminal proceeding." Here is the lie that Jesse Watters told on Fox yesterday at 5:28 p.m. when Donald Trump was watching.
They are trying to rig this jury. They are catching undercover liberal activists lying to the judge.
Jesse Watters is the newest liar to occupy the 8 p.m. slot on Fox, the lying channel, a network that has been adjudicated to have told $785.5 million worth of lies in a defamation case. The previous occupant of the 8 p.m. slot had told so many of those lies that even Fox decided they had to let him go. And the occupant before that one of the 8 p.m. slot lost his job only after being exposed as a grievous serial sexual harasser at Fox, who in just one case paid $32 million to one woman, Bill O'Reilly, sexually harassed. Jesse Watters got his start at Fox as Bill O'Reilly's errand boy, running around with a microphone on the sidewalk, following people down the street, trying to get them to talk to him, whatever O'Reilly wanted him to do. Jesse Watters is the same person who last week said publicly that he believed that the minimum wage produces an income of $100,000 a year in America. That's how stupid you can be on Fox at 8 p.m., or in the case of Jesse Watters, also at 5 p.m. Jesse Watters was taught how to lie on TV by his mentor, the now banished Bill O'Reilly, and he is paid for it by Rupert Murdoch. Jesse Watters said they are trying to rig the jury. That is a lie. Jesse Watters said they are catching undercover liberal activists. That is a lie. There has not been a single liberal activist or conservative activist revealed in the jury selection process, not one. And Jesse Watters said that they are lying to the judge, and that is a lie. That is a pure Bill O'Reilly, Jesse Waters style lie, invented from absolutely nothing. And 18 minutes after Jesse Waters extemporaneously delivered that lie on the Fox Lying Channel, Donald Trump wrote this lie. They are catching undercover liberal activists lying to the judge in order to get on the Trump jury. And Donald Trump assigned that lie, in quotation marks, to Jesse Waters. The problem on that now for Donald Trump is twofold. One, Donald Trump rewrote Jesse Waters' lie. So he cannot put it in quotation marks the way he did and ascribe it to Jesse Waters. Jesse Waters never said the phrase, in order to get on the Trump jury. That's Donald Trump's original composition. That's his writing. So that is going to become a challenge for Donald Trump's lawyers when this issue is the subject of a hearing on Tuesday. Because today, Donald Trump's lawyer claimed that Donald Trump was just reposting statements that are already in public by others. That's not what Donald Trump did. He rewrote that statement. And here's the second part of Donald Trump's problem. It doesn't matter whether he quoted Jesse Waters accurately or not, because the gag order against Donald Trump prevents Donald Trump from making statements about any prospective juror or any actual juror in this criminal proceeding. Donald Trump made a statement about the jurors in this case at 5:46 p.m. last night. And that's what made the district attorney throw up his hands this morning and say, it's ridiculous, it has to stop. To which Judge Juan Merchan said nothing other than, quote, after the hearing, I will rule. Judge Merchan did not warn Donald Trump today to make no more statements about the jury. None of the 6 other violations of the gag order that the district attorney brought to the judge's attention this morning prompted the judge to issue an immediate verbal warning to Donald Trump, sitting right in front of him and his lawyers, about Donald Trump's violations of the gag order. The judge did not warn Donald Trump that this kind of thing this is the kind of thing that could actually get him thrown in jail. Nothing like that was said. The judge's plan, if he has one, appears to be, let me get my jury seated and all of the alternate jurors seated, and then on Tuesday, we'll try to deal with this. When Donald Trump left the courtroom today, he did not talk about the jurors. He did not talk about witnesses. He did not violate the gag order in any way. He did, however, tell this lie.
I'm supposed to be in New Hampshire. I'm supposed to be in Georgia. I'm supposed to be in North Carolina, South Carolina. I'm supposed to be in a lot of different places campaigning. But I've been here all day on a trial that really is a very unfair trial.
New Hampshire is half an hour away in Donald Trump's private plane. The most distant of those states, Georgia, is 2 hours away in Donald Trump's private plane. South Carolina, North Carolina, all easy to get to. Yesterday, when there was no court session and Donald Trump stayed home and did absolutely nothing. In fact, most presidential campaigns easily cover 4 states in one day, especially when 3 of them are contiguous: Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. That's an easy sweep in one day. Donald Trump could have gone to every one of those states yesterday in his private plane, but he didn't. And he's lying about the trial, costing him 1 minute of campaign time. It hasn't done that. He remains the laziest presidential campaigner in history. That same person who has been falling asleep in the courtroom just doesn't seem to have the energy for the campaign trail. Certainly not the way Joe Biden does, who was once again in Pennsylvania today. Donald Trump's lie about not being able to campaign was not his only complaint today. His other complaint was, I suppose, more understandable, coming from a 77-year-old man from Florida.
And I'm sitting here for days now, from morning till night, in that freezing room, freezing.
Joining our discussion now, Adam Klasfeld, who was in the courthouse today and who survived the freezing in the courthouse somehow. He will be there every day for us at the Trump trial. He's a fellow at Just Security. Also joining us, Andrew Weissmann, former FBI General Counsel, former chief of the Criminal Division, the Eastern District of New York, and co-author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Trump Indictments, The Historic Charging Documents with Commentary. And Neil Katyal is with us, former acting U.S. Solicitor General, who has argued over 50 cases before the Supreme Court. He is professor at Georgetown Law School and host of the podcast Courtside with Neil Katyal. They're both MSNBC legal analysts. And Adam, let me just start with you since you were there today. This unfolded so strangely. We are saying that we have 12 jurors seated tonight, but we don't know how many we're going to have tomorrow morning, because when you showed up in the morning, you lost 2.
That is correct, Lawrence. We lost 2 because we found out very early on that one of the jurors had her identity figured out. And this turned into an exchange between the judge basically directing the news media not to report certain information such as the physical appearance of the jurors, their occupations. And that juror, the first one that we lost, was one of the ones who said no one is above the law. Mm-hmm. The second juror that we lost was the one that we talked about the last time we were speaking, who had commented on Trump being so fascinating and mysterious. Well, it turned out the prosecution had looked into some of his backstory and learned that he had torn down some political advertisements and didn't disclose that to the government. And the government had the DA's office disclosed it dutifully in court, and that's why we became 2 fewer. And one of the most astonishing things was how quickly we went from 2 steps back to a full panel. Yeah. It just happened at the end of the day in rapid order.
Yeah, Andrew, I thought by 11 o'clock this morning, like, okay, this is another 2 weeks of jury selection the way this is going.
Well, you have to remember that slow part is the questioning of the sort of pool. Yeah. But once that questioning's done and you've weeded out the for cause, the people who cannot sit because both sides or the judge has ultimately agreed they cannot be fair, then it's just the peremptories, which is, you turn to each side and you're like, Lawrence, do you want to strike this person? Adam, do you want to strike this? Next. You just go back and forth and you're done.
Right.
And also by the end of the day, both sides were out of peremptories. Mm-hmm. So that gets restocked tomorrow for the alternates. But once you've done that initial questioning, it is a fast process. So I think everyone thought this was going to be slower because they watched the sort of initial questioning and didn't realize once that's done, it's fast.
Neil, I'm wondering about your perception of how the judge is handling this situation in the courtroom with Donald Trump, because clearly a judge in a case like this has the appeal on his mind all the time. He knows if there's a guilty verdict here that Donald Trump is going to appeal this. He's going to appeal this in as many ways and as many angles as he possibly can. And is there something that the judge has to worry about in the possible appeals future of this case that inhibits him in policing right now Donald Trump's conduct, for example, including attacking jurors?
Yes. So the judge is absolutely right to worry about an appeal. Trump's going to file an appeal if he's convicted, no matter what. And trial judges, Lawrence, generally have a lot of discretion over how to run their trials. And so the thumb on the scale is going to be in favor of the judge, but that doesn't give him an unlimited blank check. So I think today generally was a good day. We took 8 steps forward and only 2 back. That's a good day in Trump trial world because they're trying to find 12 people in Manhattan who don't have strong feelings about Donald Trump. I mean, that's like harder than trying to find a happy New York Jets fan in New York. I mean, it's a hard thing to do, but it looks like the judge has managed to do it. The problem is you've got Donald Trump testing the judge at every turn, basically trolling him. When the judge has issued a gag order, Trump defies it. And Trump's basic view is, I dare you to do something. And there is going to be a hearing on Tuesday. And I do suspect, at the very least, the prosecution's going to get what they ask for, which is $1,000 fines for each of these violations. The harder question is what happens after that? Is the judge going to say the next time it's up to 30 days of incarceration? I suspect the judge will do something like that because you cannot run a trial this way. And, one thing he did today, Lawrence, which was interesting, you're absolutely right. He didn't impose any sanctions today for violating the gag order. But at the end, something interesting happened. The defense asked, who are the 3 prosecution witnesses that are going to be called on tomorrow on the first day of the trial? The prosecutors said, we're not going to tell you who they are because your client is going to go and tweet about them and attack them. And the judge agreed with that and said, we're not giving you those witness names. So I do think that's the start of the judge starting to have a backbone here on these issues. I think he's absolutely well within his rights to have one. And I'm looking forward to seeing what he'll do on Tuesday.
Yeah, Andrew, that's the last page of the transcript. It's one of the more dramatic things in here, where the defense counsel routinely asks for, please tell us your first 3 witnesses because we may be getting to witnesses as early as Monday. And he asks for that. And the prosecutor says, look, I got to be honest, that's a courtesy that we would normally extend. Mr. Trump has been tweeting about the witnesses. We're not telling you who the witnesses are. I'm sorry. The judge says, I can't fault the people for that. And then Trump's defense lawyer says, what if I commit to the court and the people that President Trump will not tweet about any witness? And Adam, I believe there was laughter in the press room on that one when they heard that, right? And the judge said that he will not tweet about any witness, to which Trump's lawyer said, well, it couldn't even guarantee him that he wouldn't tweet about any witness. And the judge said, I don't think you can make that representation. And then Trump's lawyer says, what if it's just the attorney's eyes only? We won't share it with President Trump. And to which the judge says, no, I don't think that's going to work. And then the Trump lawyer says, well, they're required to give us the witness list for Monday if the judge orders it, to which the judge says, well, I'm not going to order them to do it. No, I'll see you tomorrow morning. And that's as rough an ending as I've seen of a court day.
I want to make sure people understand it is when you have everyone operating in good faith and people comply with the rules, it is standard procedure to let both sides do that. When it's the defense case, when it's the government's case, you give the other side notice. This is well within the DA's discretion because they know what's happened. They're like, we are actually not going to give you the opportunity. The part about counsel I find very interesting, and that's where Todd Blanche has really lost credibility with the court, because that's where if the judge sees that there's reputable counsel, and I'm saying he's not, I'm just saying obviously the judge has lost confidence in Todd Blanche, because that's where the judge could have said, I will give it to you, Mr. Blanche, but you have to promise me, and that usually would work. One thing I wanted to notice about your opening about the sort of complicity with sort of Fox in terms of how this worked, that is the charge here. The charge here is complicity with the National Enquirer. The idea that what has just happened here is what you're going to hear about what the charge in this case is about, the complicity of Donald Trump and David Pecker and the National Enquirer to do a catch and kill scheme and to smear opponents. It is exactly the same thing that is charged here that you're seeing carried out right now in jury selection.
Yeah, and Neil, juror number 2, who's the one who came in this morning and said, listen, I don't think I can do it. She was specifically attacked by Jesse Waters in his program last night, revealing as much biographical information about her as we had. By the way, we all had that information. We held it back. We had a feeling about how much we could identify. We could say someone's a woman. We didn't want to get into too much because it made sense. The judge has now ordered everyone in the media to be as responsible as they possibly can about what they reveal. But there's Fox again tonight doing the same thing.
Absolutely. And then you have this juror say, look, I need to be excused. I'm afraid of my safety. And Lawrence, I've seen a lot in the law. The only time I've ever seen anything like this is in a mob trial. And to imagine that this is about a trial, not about a mob figure, but about our former top official of the entire government. I mean, it's just unthinkable. I mean, Donald Trump doesn't care for civic virtue, the American ideal, the stability of the system. What he's doing with this juror, what he's done before, what he did on January 6th, it's just all the same thing. He'll break the system in order to have a chance of winning. And if he were a real leader, if he were a real president, he would never put his own ambitions and interests above those of the institution and the system. But he's absolutely content to break them, to break this juror, to break the entire jury system. It's unforgivable behavior apart from being criminal. It's also just not the way we could ever want anyone in our government to operate.
Neil Katyal, Andrew Weissmann, Adam Klasfeld, thank you all very much for starting off our discussion tonight. We'll be right back. Back with us, Adam Klasfeld and Andrew Weissmann, and we all have our transcripts of what happened today. We got them late tonight before the show. And Adam, there's a spot that you heard, but now you have the transcript for, that's very interesting about the examples that the district attorney was giving while talking to potential jurors.
Absolutely. Throughout the voir dire process, one of the things that one of the assistant district attorneys, Joshua Steinglass, had been doing all along was giving hypotheticals. Can you understand this legal concept through a hypothetical of a hitman? And one moment he
And I believe the hitman concept was you're guilty of the crime if you told the person to do it, even if you weren't in the state that they were in. And, you know, Donald Trump's somewhere other than where Michael Cohen is. That was sort of the theory of it.
Accessory liability.
Yeah.
And later, he dropped the hypothetical. And this was an incredible moment. He said, the point I'm trying to get at is that no one's going to get up on the witness stand and testify that Mr. Trump directly said, hey, let's falsify our business records. Hey, let's commit election fraud. Let's pull the wool over the eyes of the American voter so I can get elected. No one is going to say that. And in a rare moment during voir dire, Susan Necheles, Trump's lawyer, said, Judge, we object. The judge overruled. And part of what made that such an incredible moment, of course, the prosecutors are sharing the theory of the case, that this was election influence. And the other very interesting part of it was that usually during voir dire, you don't hear too many objections. They are trying to weed out a jury bias. And this was a moment that was just punctuated by that objection, by that overruled objection, and the prosecution tipping their hand into what we might be hearing in opening statements.
I was going to say, Andrew, that sounds like a line from opening statements that was very effectively slipped into this process today.
Yeah, well, you know, what the prosecution wanted to make sure was that any potential juror can understand that you may not have direct evidence. You know, it's very rare that in a mob case, no one says, by the way, we have an agreement that we're in the Gambino family and we're going to conduct this hit as part of the Gambino family. Nothing's that explicit. It's not, a corporate document that's been signed. And so this is a standard thing that you would ask to make sure that jurors understand it, and it sort of conditions them. I'm a little surprised that Susan made the objection, because when you make an objection like that, if it is overruled, you're somewhat you're sort of underscore the importance of what just happened.
We have to interrupt this for breaking news. We are monitoring breaking news in Iran. For more, we're going to be joined now by NBC News, Pentagon, and National Security correspondent Courtney Kube. Courtney, what do we have?
So, Lawrence, there has been some breaking news all this evening that we've been trying to get more detail on. Here's what we know so far. According to Iran's semi-official state media, that's Fars, they are saying that there have been a series of explosions in Iran, in a city called Isfahan. Now, why a lot of our viewers may have heard of that city is because it's where some of Iran's critical nuclear infrastructure exists. But so far, it seems that these explosions are not specifically in Isfahan, where the nuclear facility is, but are nearby. Now, the U.S. officials are not saying anything about this. Neither are Israeli officials. But of course, this all comes when there has been this back and forth between Iran and Israel and threats from both sides. Now, of course, on April 1st, the Israeli military struck a site in Damascus, which was later determined to be some sort of a consular site killing a number of senior Iranian officials, including a senior general in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Of course, we know, Lawrence, that last weekend, Iran retaliated with pretty great force, about 300 projectiles, missiles, and drones, most of which were shot down. But Israel again vowed to respond. Now, among the possible response options that we have been hearing about this week that Israel briefed the U.S. on ahead of the strikes last weekend was the possibility of some sort of a response inside Iran, but also the possibility of strikes against proxy forces and against Iranian facilities outside of Iran. There are also some reports tonight of explosions in Syria and in Iraq. But I really have to stress at this point, we do not have any confirmation who was behind any of these explosions, these possible strikes, other than to say everyone has really been waiting on edge to see if Israel would respond to this massive volley of strikes that they took against Israel, that Iran took against Israel on Saturday, Lawrence.
And Courtney, this is ahead of where our information is now, but a few days from now, or whatever amount of time it takes, when would we have, or could we have, an accurate assessment, damage assessment of what might have actually occurred tonight?
So we're already seeing, frankly, some social media video of explosions over the skies in Isfahan. There's some things that are starting to come out from both Iraq and Syria. So we may get a better sense of that in the next day or so. It's about daylight in all three locations right now, Friday morning. So we may get a sense of that. The real question, though, is will we get any attribution to this? Now, keep in mind, there's a widespread knowledge that Israel has taken a number of strikes inside Syria in recent years, specifically usually going after Lebanese Hezbollah, going after shipments of component parts, advanced missile parts that Iran ships to Hezbollah in Syria. And they very rarely, if ever, acknowledge any of those strikes. It would not surprise me if we don't have any statement of attribution for who is behind these, except for the fact that Israel's been vowing to respond here. So, again, I have to say, we still don't know who or what caused these explosions in these three locations. We've been working on this feverishly for a matter of hours now, Lawrence, and will continue. But at this point, again, the U.S. and the Israelis are not saying anything. And even Iran, while acknowledging there have been explosions, is not saying who or what was behind them.
Courtney Kube, Pentagon correspondent, thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. We're going to come back to you as this story develops. And joining us now is Ben Rhodes, who served as Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. He's an MSNBC political analyst. Ben, on the issue of attribution, will the United States issue a statement of having nothing to do with it, possibly?
Yeah, that's quite possible. And in fact, Lawrence, in the past, even when Israel has taken strikes against Iranian targets in third countries, in places like Lebanon and Syria, sometimes the United States does put out a statement to clarify that it itself was not involved. That said, I mean, it's not a mystery, if you have this kind of attack, particularly if it's in Isfahan and if it's against Iranian proxies in places like Iraq and Syria, I don't think there's going to be a ton of mystery around it. I think what we can say with assurance is that the United States itself did not participate in that kind of military activity. What
do you expect in terms of the unfolding of this information at this hour? When might we hear something from more clear or something official from the Pentagon?
Well, I think that, it's likely that assuming Israel carried out these strikes, they would notify the United States probably shortly beforehand. If they did carry out strikes inside of Iran at a place like Isfahan, that obviously would go against what Joe Biden had counseled them, which is to not directly retaliate against Iranian territory. I think the U.S. has a greater degree of tolerance and understanding of Israeli strikes against Iranian proxies across the region. But even in the event in which the Israeli government knows that the Biden administration might not support their action, they would still notify the United States. I think that it's necessary, though, to wait and see whether this is the conclusion of a military action. Is this a series of kind of one-off strikes in Iraq and Syria and Iran, or is it the beginning of several strikes that could take place in different places? I think the U.S., before it comments in any formal way, would obviously want to know and be certain that this latest round of escalation has concluded. So, I'd expect that to happen kind of over our night. But again, I think the U.S. will also take some lead from whether or not Israel is publicly commenting, publicly taking responsibility for these strikes. Given how much Israel said that it was going to respond, even though it's sometimes been reluctant to claim responsibility for certain military actions, given how far they've been out there saying they're going to respond, I have to assume we get some confirmation from the Israeli side, too, in the coming hours.
Take us inside the White House on a night like this. They've had this information, Courtney indicates, for a number of hours now. You've been there. You've been in the White House where this kind of information comes across at, say, 8 p.m., and you end up spending the rest of the night there. What's happening in the offices that you used to be in at this hour in this situation?
Well, I think what you'd be doing is if you find out that something like this is happening, that's a significant potential escalation in the Middle East, you're bringing everybody together in the White House Situation Room and by secure video conference to the Pentagon and the State Department and the intelligence community. Number one, you're trying to ascertain what happened. If Israel did take military action, what were their targets? What was their success in hitting those targets? Number two, you're taking extra precautions to secure U.S. personnel and military facilities across the region and diplomatic facilities. By the way, Lawrence, we have vulnerable facilities to potential Iranian reprisal in places like Iraq. And so part of, job one of any administration is to make sure that we're ramping up the defenses of our personnel if we see escalation in the region. Then I think you're undertaking a diplomatic strategy, reaching out to Israel to get an understanding, okay, if you did do this, is this it? Or is this the beginning of further escalation? Reaching out to other countries in the region, the Arab states, what are they hearing? Trying to send messages to the Iranians. Don't respond. We're trying to de-escalate. We're trying to avoid this becoming a regional war. And so those are your main priorities, understanding what's happening, protecting U.S. personnel and facilities in the region, and trying to avert an escalation that clearly the Biden administration doesn't want.
Ben, what about the concept of proportional response? When Israel is planning a strike like this, do they assess the damage that they suffered, which was minimal in this case, since the defenses were so effective against the Iranian drones? Do they assess the damage they suffered and try to inflict something proportional to that?
Yeah, that will be the really interesting thing to watch, Lawrence, in the sense that proportional response carries with it a certain military logic. The problem since October 7th is we're in new terrain. So it's not the same kind of proxy war that's taken place between Israel and Iran across the region. New lines are being crossed, whether it was the Israeli strike on an Iranian diplomatic facility or obviously the Iranian attack directly on Israel. However, what will be interesting in watching this is if Israel did strike inside of Iran at a place like Isfahan, did they, in the same way that Iran kind of signaled, we could have done more, we wanted to launch an attack on your territory, but we didn't, unleash thousands of rockets from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Does Israel similarly kind of signal this is a relatively minimalist response compared to what we might have been able to do otherwise? I think this is all very dangerous in any event. If you have exchanges of fire between Israel and Iran in the region, that's new. That hasn't happened before. So that's dangerous, even if it is meant to be proportional. But the interesting question about the Israeli strike is whether it is kind of designed to be somewhat limited in nature in terms of what it does inside of Iran. And then that puts the onus on the Iranians. OK, do they feel like they need to respond against Israel directly, or do they kind of revert to the proxy war where they're exchanging fire, they're exchanging conflict in other parts of the Middle East?
Ben, please stay with us. Joining us now is NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli. Mike, what do we know from the White House tonight?
Lawrence, frankly, not very much. The White House has not been responding to any questions about these reports of explosions that we're seeing in the Middle East. That speaks to, I think, the posture of de-escalation being the watchword of the administration at this point. Bill Burns, the CIA director, spoke tonight at an event at the Bush Center in Dallas. He called Iran's attempted response over the weekend a spectacular failure. And I want to read this quote directly, he said, "I think the broad hope of the president and policymakers in the administration is that we'll find a way to de-escalate the situation." And so I think they're standing back at this point, waiting to, one, confirm on its own resources what has happened tonight, just how potentially why the response Israel has launched, if it has in fact launched one. They're certainly obviously working behind the scenes to coordinate with their allies. It's worth noting, Lawrence, that there were a series of conversations between White House officials, administration officials, and their Israeli counterparts throughout the day. There was a small meeting that included Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, and his Israeli counterpart to discuss, in the words of the readout from the White House, to discuss the Iran attack and the collective efforts to further enhance Israel's defense. That was then followed by a broader meeting to discuss the situation in Gaza and the potential for the ground invasion, the U.S. continuing to advise the Israelis against that. We also know that the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, spoke with his Israeli counterpart today. So there are a series of events throughout the day that speak to the close coordination between these two allies. And we know from our own reporting, Courtney Kube, who you've already heard from, as well as Monica Alba earlier in this week, that the White House has had an awareness of a range of options that Israel could potentially take in response to Iran's efforts over the weekend. That included potentially a more limited response. It could include strikes outside of Iran, which we have seen at least potential reports of tonight, as well as strikes in Iran. We know that President Biden, in a conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu over the weekend, said that the U.S. would not join Israel in any potential offensive operations. Lawrence, there's been a term that we've heard quite a bit this week, which is take the win. That's sort of the sense of what the U.S. government has been communicating to Israel to avoid that term, escalation. That's certainly been the hope of the White House. That's what we've heard publicly from Bill Burns and obviously from officials throughout the week, that their hope is tonight. And they're standing back at this point to wait and see what the situation is, if it has concluded yet, or if there's going to be even further response tonight.
Mike, I know the president has been on the campaign trail in Pennsylvania most of the week. Is the president at the White House tonight?
Yeah, Lawrence, I was with the president in Scranton for 2 days this week. He also, of course, made those stops in Pittsburgh and today in Philadelphia, that event with the Kennedy family. He returned to the White House tonight just before about 5 p.m. So he has been in the White House for most of the evening. We have no sense of whether he had any further meetings with his national security team or advisors. He did return, we should say, to the West Wing when he came back tonight. So that spoke to the fact that even though he had a full day on the campaign trail, his work wasn't done for the day, surrounded by some of his closest officials. Bruce Reed walking into the Oval Office with him when he returned to the White House tonight.
Mike, what is the standard practice, if we can call it a standard practice, in a situation like this for the White House press corps? Do you expect that the White House press corps will be given some information by the White House tonight about this?
Well, let's start with the term that you know well, Lawrence. There was a lid called this evening. Mm-hmm. That means that there was not any expectation that, of course, at the very least, we would see the president tonight. That doesn't necessarily rule out potential statements being released from the press office. It certainly doesn't rule out us working the phones, as we have been all night, sending emails, texts to our sources, trying to get any information we can. And so obviously those conversations are ongoing. But at this point, we have not gotten any indication that the White House will respond in any formal way until it has more information. This is certainly something that could change. This is a dynamic situation, and certainly any further escalation would warrant a response from the administration. But at this point, it's not our expectation, Lawrence, even though we're certainly trying to get more information to the public at this point.
I want to bring Ben Rhodes back into this discussion from that perspective, Ben, of inside the White House. Of all of the issues that have to be dealt with inside of the White House, one of them is informing Mike Memoli and therefore the country about what's going on. This is a president who knows now that, it's 7:45 p.m. on the West Coast. This is a country that is mostly wide awake right now, consuming this news and eager to know what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, Lawrence, I mean, I kind of had that responsibility for a lot of years in the White House. And I think your considerations in that regard are when it's a very sensitive international incident like this, speed is actually not your first priority. Like, you want to be heard in the manner that you want to be heard at the right time. And in this case, there are other considerations. First of all, what is Israel going to say? Right. So if Israel undertook this military action, before you say anything out of the White House, you need to be clear about what it is the Israeli government's going to say about whether they want to take responsibility for this, how they want to describe their military action, whether they want to say that this is concluded, that from their perspective, this is a reprisal attack and not is the end of what they're going to do, or whether they're going to signal something more ambiguous. Right. And so you have to understand diplomatically, okay, what is Israel going to say? Then you need to make a determination about whether you're going to both confirm events and then how are you going to describe the American view of what took place. The Biden administration is in a particularly difficult circumstance here because they counseled Israel to not engage in a military strike on Iranian soil. And so they're in a difficult bind here because simultaneously they have, generally sided obviously with Israel in these regional conflicts, and yet they've been on the record in saying that Israel should not undertake this kind of military action directly against Iran in response to the attack. And so the statement that they draft is going to have to be calibrated. Now, if Israel is coming out and saying, this is it, we're done, this is our response to what took place, that makes it easier for the Biden administration to pivot to a message of de-escalation, this is over, we're calling on everybody to de-escalate. If this is still an open-ended military operation by Israel, that becomes more tricky, and the Biden administration may want to say, we urge Israel to refrain from further military action. We're urging them to de-escalate, right? So you want to calibrate your initial message based off of what you're understanding Israel is doing. And at the same time, obviously you might in the interim confirm some things for people like Mike Memoli, but before your official statement goes out, you want to make sure you know what your policy response is.
Mike, do you have any information about who else is at the White House at this hour in your sourcing? Do we have any sense of whether there is a Situation Room meeting going on, whether National Security Advisor is physically present, possibly the Defense Secretary? Any sense of who might actually be there now?
No, I mean, the one clue, of course, as you know well, Lawrence, and Ben, of course, knows, we are occasionally taking steps outside the press briefing room to look at the entrance to the West Wing to see if there is that Marine Sentinel there, which would speak to the president's presence in the West Wing, potentially as well in the Situation Room. We have not seen that tonight, but of course, the president is known for working late sometimes. He prefers to do so in the private residence where he has an office. We've seen often where his advisors will visit with him there. But if obviously this were to be a situation in which he wants to communicate with other world leaders, with our allies, that would require, it would certainly speak to a likelihood of him heading into the West Wing at this point. And so we have no indications that that's happened tonight. I think one thing that's also interesting as we look at this situation, Lawrence, is the unusual communication that's occurred between the U.S. government and the Iranian through intermediaries. We know ahead of or just after that April 1st strike by Israel of the Iranian diplomatic compound in Damascus that, according to NBC's reporting, there was an effort to communicate by the U.S. government to Iran that it had no foreknowledge of that planned strike. We also know from an interview that was conducted with the Iranian foreign minister today, he said that the Iranian government had communicated a message to the United States through its embassy in Switzerland, to discuss potential ramifications of an Israeli retaliation. And so there is this sort of effort to communicate, which speaks to the U.S.'s goal here of avoiding a further escalation, of trying to be able to be in that position. Yes, the president has made it crystal clear, even with his many deep disagreements with how Prime Minister Netanyahu has engaged in responding to the attack on his country and the counterattack on Hamas, through Gaza, that there are certainly serious differences, but he will not waver in his support for the state of Israel, for its right to defend itself. But it does speak to, of course, he has that role of wanting to avoid a further escalation that could put Israel at risk itself.
Ben Rhodes, you worked in the White House that had the best, the strongest communication channels to Iran of any White House since the fall of the Shah, possibly, with the Obama administration working on the nuclear deal with Iran through Secretary of State John Kerry. The Trump administration then lost really all of those communication channels to Iran, didn't want them, just kind of wiped them out. How much of that communication has been rebuilt during the Biden administration, and how much of that communication do you think is available tonight?
Well, I don't think that much has been rebuilt in terms of direct contacts. I mean, we obviously didn't have formal diplomatic relations reestablished in an embassy in the Obama years, but we did have the capacity for, John Kerry to pick up the phone as Secretary of State and call the Iranian foreign minister. And we had people down below that who were able to be in direct contacts on a bilateral basis with Iran. My sense is in the Biden administration, it's kind of reverted back to the way it was in the early stages of those negotiations, where a lot of contact comes through third parties. The U.S. has, through the Swiss and kind of interest capacity in Tehran to pass messages through the Swiss government. But then beyond that, there are other governments in the region that have often been a conduit for sensitive diplomatic channels between the U.S. and Iran. Oman has traditionally played a role in facilitating messages passed back and forth between the U.S. and Iran. I think there are other regional partners, whether it's Turkey or even the Gulf Arab states that have relatively strained relations with Iran, that can be a source of messages. I think also in this situation, Lawrence, where, let's face it, we step back, there are global ramifications here. A full all-out war between Israel and Iran could have enormous ramifications for the global economy, for energy markets. China, I think, is probably a source of messaging for the United States. The U.S. going to the Chinese, who obviously have a lot of influence with Iran, and saying, look, can you please communicate? This is not the time to escalate. This is not the time, on top of the war in Ukraine, to have another all-out war in the Middle East. And so I think the U.S. is probably trying everything they can. Now, ironically, in this circumstance, the U.S. Advice to Israel has not always necessarily been heeded under Prime Minister Netanyahu. And so we're simultaneously probably trying to de-escalate in terms of the Israeli action as well as the Iranian response.
Mike Memoli, what will you be looking for first thing in the morning at the White House?
Well, I think the first question is, will we see any change in the president's schedule? He has on the public schedule for tomorrow a union event. He's been doing a lot of those lately, Lawrence. He's set to speak at a union conference here in Washington, part of the series of events he's been doing, especially focused on the economy this week when his Republican opponent has been, let's say, distracted with other matters. Then he was scheduled, as he often does for the weekend, to travel to Wilmington, Delaware. We did see, of course, the president return from Delaware last week when we were aware of the response coming from Iran, the attempted attack on Israel. And now, of course, that potential does remain as well for him to change his schedule.
Rejoining our coverage now is NBC News Pentagon and National Security Correspondent Courtney Kube. Courtney, do we have anything more?
Yeah, so we can now say, Lawrence, that according to a source familiar, Israel did carry out an operation inside Iran tonight. Now, we still don't have a lot of details, including how they carried this out. But again, as we've been saying, Iranian state media has reported that there have been a number of explosions in the Isfahan area. Now, I should say, just because this was an Israeli operation, we don't have to assume that that means that Israeli warplanes flew into Iranian airspace. The Israeli military has a number of what are called standoff weapons. They have the ability to fire from far away, so they would not put pilots or even some of their unmanned systems in any kind of danger to carry out some sort of a strike or some sort of operation like this. Again, we're still working on exactly what the Israelis used to carry this out. But we can now report that, in fact, the Israelis did carry out an operation in Iran tonight. Now, in addition to that, we are told that the Israeli officials informed the U.S. of their intention to carry out a response in the coming, not necessarily imminently, but today they did tell them they were planning to do that without putting an exact idea of exactly when it would happen. Again, the Israelis did inform the U.S. of this in advance. Now, why that's so critical is that April 1st strike that the Israeli military took in Damascus, killing those senior Iranian officials. There has been, the U.S. has said openly and often that they were not notified of that in advance. And in fact, the U.S. was told about this one. We don't know about all the details, exactly how much fidelity the U.S. had on this, but they were told by the Israelis in advance.
Ben Rhodes, how does that sound to you in terms of the procedure of Israel notifying the United States today in advance of what happened tonight?
Yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me, Lawrence. I mean, that sounds right that they would give some notification that this was taking place. They know that the U.S. is their most important partner. They know that the U.S. has its own personnel in the region that we might want to take precautions to secure because of this Israeli strike. So despite the fact that there's been this disagreement about whether or not the U.S. supports the idea of Israel taking this strike, it stands to reason that they would provide that notification. Now, it also puts the U.S. in a bit of a challenging spot because, number one, we did counsel them against taking the strike. Number two, this means that we had foreknowledge. And one of the reasons that the U.S. might have been public about saying we didn't know about the strike that was going to take place in Damascus is it kind of removes us from that equation. Thus far, the Iranians have been very clear in their messaging to the U.S. that they do not want to fight with us. And frankly, the U.S. has been pretty clear, too, that we're not looking to be directly involved in a military conflict with Iran. And so one of the objectives for the U.S. is to continue, I think, to try to stay out of this fight directly. In this instance, I think it's prudent that Israel would give that heads up and that America might take precautions. We now need to wait and see, number one, is this the conclusion of this wave of the Israeli retaliation? And number two, does Iran respond? And do they respond quickly? And do they respond either through a direct attack on Israel, as they did in the past? Do they mobilize and activate some of their proxies? Does Hezbollah take action from southern Lebanon against Israel? I think a worst case for the United States is, do we start to see some of those Iranian proxy groups that were attacking U.S. forces a few months ago, do they reactivate in terms of attacks on the U.S. diplomatic presence in Iraq or U.S. troops presence in places like Syria, or do the Houthis get involved more aggressively in the Red Sea? So everybody's going to be watching to see what the next move is by both Israel and Iran and all of Iran's proxies. And I'm sure that that's part of what is happening in the White House tonight, is just making sure that we're doing everything we can to avoid this escalating further, but also making sure that we have our eyes on all the different ways in which this fire could catch in other places.
Courtney, I want to ask you a version of a question that I just asked Mike about the White House tomorrow. On the assumption that we're not going to have any United States government officials stepping before a microphone tonight, what will you be looking for at the Pentagon tomorrow morning?
So keep in mind that in the past, when Israel has carried out strikes against some of these proxy groups, like Ben was just talking about, for instance, in Syria, when they go after these advanced missile components and parts that Iran is sending to Hezbollah in Syria, they very rarely, if ever, acknowledge that. I think the biggest question is will Israel acknowledge any part of this tonight because of their threats that they've been putting out all week to respond to the attacks in Israel last weekend? If and when that happens, that would be when we might see someone in the U.S. talking about it. I have to say, unless Israel acknowledges this, any part in this tonight, I don't know that the U.S. would acknowledge it on the record. And I have to say, I completely agree with what Ben was explaining about the process here. The Israelis will, these sorts of strikes that they take in Syria, remember, the U.S. has military in southern Syria and eastern Syria operating there. When they carry out attacks against some of these proxy groups, Israel will give the U.S. a heads up. Sometimes it's literally when the planes are in the air, the jets are in the air to carry out the strikes, but they do it for a deconfliction. But they also do it because if there's a potential that U.S. U.S. forces or personnel in the region could have some sort of a negative impact from an Israeli mission or operation, they have sort of an agreement that they'll give the U.S. a heads up so that they'll know to up their readiness, any kind of defenses that need to be shored up, that they'll be able to do that in advance. So it wouldn't surprise me that the Israelis would give them some sort of a heads up today. We just don't know exactly the level of detail that they provided at this point, Lawrence.
Ben, quickly, as we're running out of time here, what is the United States hoping for from Israel on this now?
Or is that there's a de-escalatory period here, that Israel, whether they say it publicly or whether it's something that they signal privately to the Iranians, indicate we're not looking to escalate this further. This doesn't end the conflict, the proxy conflict between Israel and Iran, but this kind of exchange of direct fire between Israel and Iran, that this is over. One of the main U.S. interests since October 7th has been avoiding an all-out war between Israel and Iran, or even an escalation of the war that's in Gaza to places like Lebanon at a kind of full scale. And I think that will continue to be the focus of the Biden administration tomorrow, is just trying to contain this so that it doesn't continue to spiral into escalation.
Courtney Kube, Mike Bentley, Ben Rhodes, thank you all very much for guiding us through this breaking news story.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.